Hey guys, Omar here, and in this video we're going to talk about becoming an intermediate photographer. And I kind of remember the time when I became an intermediate photographer, and what does that actually mean? There was something great that Rick Salmon said about learning photography. I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember exactly the words he used, but it was something like, there are 4 levels of photography. The first one being unconscious incompetence. And basically that just meant you didn't know that you sucked. You just took any pictures. You were unconscious about your incompetence. The second level was kind of like an awakening. He called it a conscious incompetence, which meant you were aware that you sucked. You knew that you sucked, which is the first step into becoming a better photographer. Third, he described how you are conscious of your competence. And this is where what we're going to talk about in this video is where you know how to work your gear and you're conscious about it and you're very conscious about all the photographs you take. So there's more a deliberateness to all your settings, and maybe this is a great stage because it's very exploratory. You're trying a lot of different things, a lot of different focal lengths, a lot of different wide angle, zoom. You're conscious of being competent. And the last stage, which we'll never get to, is mastery. And Rick Salmon described this as kind of like a rock star guitarist that can jam without even thinking. And he called that unconscious competence. Unconscious competence. You're so good, you're unconscious about what you're doing. We always strive to be in this level. But most people are humble and don't admit that they're a master at all, even though I am. Okay, let's get started. Okay, thinking like an intermediate photographer. The first thing you want to think about is how much control do you want to give your camera? Do you want it to take care of everything? Do you want to take care of some stuff? Or do you want to be a control freak? So the first thing you want to do is, as you walk around, how do you want your camera to perform? The next thing is, you want to make sure you always have a decent exposure, as opposed to an indecent exposure. So you want to make sure the photograph obviously can be seen by everyone. So we always think exposure. Now in the DSLR days, you had to think about what your meter was doing a little bit more. For the most part, you can keep your meter on the matrix or the evaluative or the one that looks at the overall scene and does some computer mumbo jumbo. So the meter used to be more important. But for the most part now, your camera, especially if you're shooting mirrorless, you can see your exposure. So your meter will come into play as we get into talking more about spot metering and when you want to be more in control of your meter. So although your meter is related to exposure, I'm going to put it down here for now because it's not in my thought process so much. Now the next thing is for your photograph, I want to know how much of the background I want to see, which makes me decide which aperture I want. But it's also important what's going on in the scene. Do I want to stop the action, or do I don't care at all? Like I can shoot at 15th of a second. So my mind, and most photographers, think about these first. If you're shooting a landscape or something with a lot of depth of field, you want to see everything in the front of the foreground, midground, foreground, underground. Then you already know you're shooting at f16, f11, yada yada. Okay, so your mind is, what do I want? How much depth do I want in the photograph? Now, if shutter speed is a problem or is bugging what you're trying to do over here, well then come to the rescue is ISO. So the interplay between ISO, shutter, and aperture. Now this guy is kind of like taking a back seat. These two are more important in my mind when I'm doing photography, and the ISO is there to help this guy. So anytime you want a faster shutter, you're raising your ISO. So the ISO kind of hangs out more on this side than this side, okay? So these two I'm thinking all the time, this one next, and this one helping. All right, so now we have the image completely exposed. We have to decide our composition. So if you're shooting prime lenses, obviously this is completely set for you. Your focal length is set. But if you're shooting a zoom, you need to decide, well, how much depth of field do I want? Because if you go wide, you're going to have less depth of field. If you zoom into something like that nice little fox in the woods, you're going to have less depth of field. So like a 600 millimeter lens will beep, boop, 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 beep. But a wide 10 millimeter lens or 8 millimeter lens will have a large depth of field. So depending on what look you want to think about your focal length. Focal length obviously also affects the appearance of the person because you move closer to them. If you have a wide lens, you have to move closer to them, so you get a fisheye look. If you have a zoom lens, you have to move further back, so that sort of gives them a different look. So your distance will change if your focal length will change. Now, other things are, well, the person better be in focus. So I always think focus mode. Am I in a continuous focus? Am I in single focus, or am I going to manually focus? This also changes with camera brand. My Sony cameras are always on continuous focus full time. They're super fast in continuous focus. My Fujifilm cameras are in single focus for the most part, unless someone is moving. Your focus point, small, or do you want a full zone? That will depend on the situation. And another intangible is how many shots are you taking? This again depends on the situation, so that one is sort of down at the bottom. All right, so let's take a look at our first picture. Okay, a simple one, leaf in hand. So I know I want to focus on the leaf, all right? I want the ground to be sort of like color splashes. So for the first thing is, I think these two first, okay? These are the first two things that go through my head. I want a leaf that's sharp, and I want the background to be blurry. So I zoom my lens to 55. In this case, I'm using the 18 to 55 kit lens. Since I want the shallowest depth of field, I'll think about my aperture. So the aperture on this lens, if I open it up, the widest it goes is f4. So this leaf is shot at f4. And the combination of the focal length of 55 and f4 on that leaf gives me a nice depth of field. The other things are kind of secondary for this photograph. So I probably shot in a semi-auto and a semi-ISO mode. So I set the camera to a ISO auto range. Aperture priority is when I put this guy on A. And so now I have a shallow, this is not the lens I use, but I'll put it at f4. And now the camera will pick the shutter speed. Now, since I'm not moving and the leaf's not moving, I don't really have to finagle with these two so much, okay? So that's why that works in this photograph. All right, to compare, here's another leaf photo. Obviously, here what I did was I, flipped the camera with some motion. So the first thing I'm thinking is, hey, I'm gonna need a shutter speed that's gonna make these leaves blurry. All right, so I know I need to get my shutter speed down. But once you put your shutter speed on something, so this one I did at 60th of a second. Sometimes if you go 30th or 15th or 5, it's just too abstract, so you kind of experiment a little. So this photograph was taken at 60th of a second. Now with that is, what mode am I going to shoot in? Well, here there is no depth of field. I'm shooting the ground. And so I don't need to shoot at f2 or f5.6 or whatever. So for the most part, you can choose a depth of field that gives you a little bit more focus or a little sharper. So here you can pick your depth of field to be, let's say, 5.6. That's usually the sharpest part of a lens. So that's something else you think about. So now I know my leaves are going to be blurry. My image is going to be sharp. For focus mode, I know it's just a single focus. Doesn't have to be continuous. My focus point can be in the center. I got all that set. My focal length is going to be just moved by what composition I want. So this is an 18 millimeter. So that's kind of set. And now the shutter speed being the main one, I can shoot full. This is a situation where full manual is working in my brain. All right, in this street photo, I hid between two bicycles because I'm such a great street photographer. And here my thought was I was going to shoot passerbys until I got someone interesting. I ended up getting a pigeon, which is great. But here's what went through my mind as soon as I crouched. Number one, I'm shooting with a prime lens. So since I'm shooting with a prime lens, I know my focal length will stay the same. All right, so it will be 23 millimeter. So the next thing I'm thinking is I'm shooting between these bicycles, but I want a shallow depth of field because I know I'm going to focus. Where's my focus point? I'm going to focus on a specific spot on the street, and then people will walk on that into that spot, and I'll get them in focus. So my depth of field can be shallow, because I want the bicycles near me to be blurry, and I also want what's behind the person to kind of be blurry. So I pick f2. I go right to f2 on the lens. So focal length, and those are my first two things I'm thinking. And then I'm thinking exposure. Now, since I'm outside and it's bright and I'm shooting at f2, I know that the camera can take care of shutter speed to stop people walking by. Why? Because I know it's daylight, and at f2, if the camera is set to f2 and this is set to aperture priority, I put it on A here, the camera will pick a shutter speed that's fast enough. Even if I'm at ISO 200, which I'm here. And so I'm at ISO 200, which gives me a nice clear photo, and the camera picked a shutter speed of 420. Now, if I wanted to, if I was thinking a little bit, maybe a jogger go by or someone, I could have upped my ISO to 400, and that way the camera will pick an even faster shutter speed, something in the 800s. Now, for focus, there's a couple ways you can do it, but here I believe because on my cameras, I usually set to manual focus, and I can zoom into a spot on the sidewalk and focus and just leave it there. I'm not moving, and the people are moving kind of in the same plane, so that's something I usually do. But what I probably did, instead of just like zooming into a spot on the sidewalk, is I probably use my back button focus. Even though this guy's on manual focus, I always have my back button focus on and available, and I probably pointed to a certain spot, focused the middle of the sidewalk, and waited. I'm going to stop there. I have a lot more photographs that I was going to do, but this video is probably long enough already. Let me know if this was helpful, and I'll do more of them. We'll call it an intermediate series or so. Anyway, let's just stop there. I'll see you guys next time.